I'm going to say a lot of things that are probably going to make a lot of people relatively uncomfortable today. So I want to start with something that's simple, something that we all agree on, something that's not controversial. So let's start with politics. The American political system is going through one of its periodic modes of shuffling. The factions that make up the parties are moving around. So rather than think of Republicans and Democrats, I think it's better to put it up on this matrix. So if you're on the right side, an economic conservative, you want the government out of your wallet. If you're on the top, a social liberal, you want the government out of your personal life. If you're on the left, an economic liberal, you want the government to have a bigger tax take in order to rearrange society in some way. And if you're at the bottom, a social conservative, then you think that the government should play a role in regulating social morality in some way. And of course, if you're in a corner, you can combine these. So if you're at the bottom left, a social conservative and economic liberal, you like guns and you like Medicare. And if you're at the top, you're a social liberal and economic conservative, you think that the primary purpose of government should be to bring all bureaucrats everywhere to Washington, build a giant nuclear bomb, and then detonate it while they're still in the city. We're all on here somewhere. Here are traditional swing voters in the American political system today. Here is the Democratic coalition that we've come to know. And here are the Republicans. And then here is everyone together. Now, we've had a lot of weird things going on recently, but the most specific outcomes that we've had is that the Trump administration, Donald Trump personally, has brought the populace of the conservative bent in from the cold. They didn't participate in most of the last 5 elections until Trump came along. And we're talking 10 to 20 million additional voters who had not been part of the system before now are. That makes them not simply the largest faction in the Republican Party, but the largest faction across the entire American political spectrum. And to think that they're just going to vanish now that they've had a taste of power, I think is silly. But for everyone that Trump attracted, he also drove people away. This is the math and maps crowd of the Republican coalition, if you will. Military voters, fiscal conservatives, business voters. Trump drove them all away. He had clashes with all of them at various times. National security voters, or the national security establishment, he basically used as a prop. Fiscal conservatives, he ran the biggest deficits we have seen since World War II. And his mismanagement of the coronavirus crisis drove the business community away. And he didn't simply disagree with these folks. He campaigned against them in the midterms. He campaigned against them when it was time for re-election. He drove them out of his White House, and he drove them out of the party's apparatus. They, for all intents and purposes, are now swing voters. Excuse me. But he was also able to draw other people to make up for the loss of numbers. Union voters are natural allies. They're anti-free trade, they're social conservatives, and in terms of rank and file voting, he captured them en masse. Catholics had a split between the more doctrinal group, the more secular group, and then the group that kind of sees itself in the evangelist light, where the attraction of political power and marrying that to social policy really attracted them, and they became some of his most diehard supporters. And then the Hispanics are always the big surprise to most people. Yes, illegal migrants, and yes, young Hispanics, and yes, first-generation Hispanic Americans tend to be on the left. But once they hit second generation, that changes. In the border states, Trump carried the majority of the Hispanic vote, particularly in the border counties themselves. And that is a bloc that almost won him the election. They've switched. So here is our current Republican coalition. Now, there's a lot going on the Democratic side too, not just because the unions have been in motion and the Hispanics have been in motion. The Team Biden has driven the socialists out of the Democratic coalition. Now, not only did Biden beat this faction's policies with a dead horse during the debates and the primaries, and not only did he bring Obama out of retirement to campaign against wokeness, but it was really Biden's selection of Kamala Harris to be his running mate that really changed the math, because the socialists hate her. She used to be a district attorney, and you may have disagreements with her on various policies, but she put a lot of people in prison, and that just made her a non-starter for most of the socialist camp. Now, I'm sure some of you are thinking, wait a minute, how can you tell me that Kamala Harris is basically a law and order Republican from the Vietnam era? Because that's kind of how she is. What about Portland? Well, let's talk about Portland. Now, this is exactly what it looks like. This is Darth Vader wearing a dress, riding a unicycle while playing a flame-breathing bagpipe. Portland's not normal. And Portland is not representative of what this country is, or representative of what this country might one day become. Portland is no representative of the United States than Disneyland is. And with the protests we saw last year that we all think of as being big and maybe a watershed, but if you factor out the first week in Minneapolis where it all started, and of course Portland, we never had more than 50,000 people on the streets at a time nationwide. It doesn't crack the top 10 for protest movements in American history. It's just that because of COVID, we were all wed to our screens and anything that we saw became larger than life. Now, were the Black Lives Matter protests important? Sure. And can addressing them, and I mean addressing them, but everything from the Proud Boys to Antifa and everything in between, can addressing all that serve us in our cultural evolution and our national stability? Of course it can. But let's start with a little perspective. Anyway, that's where we are. Trump built a far larger and a far more cohesive social conservative Republican coalition, while the math and maps crowd were banished to the wilderness. And that's kind of where we were until January 6th. Now, we can go down any number of rabbit holes. There's a lot of lessons that happened on that day. But for purposes of this discussion of the evolution of American politics, the big takeaway is that the Republicans have proven unable or unwilling to separate themselves from the events of January 6th in specific, or Trump's inability to use or even protect law enforcement in general. That means that so long as Trump is involved with the party, the Republicans can no longer claim they are the law and order party. And the group in the American political system that is in play, that cares most about those issues, is the business community. And if you look at the folks that Biden has appointed so far, we've had about 3,500 appointments. One is a socialist, just one. And if you look at the people at the top, particularly at Treasury and Commerce, they're very pro-business. The Biden administration appears to be making a bid to include the business community in the new Republican coalition, or excuse me, the new Democratic coalition, which would make this the potential outcome. Now, I don't want anyone to get overly dejected or enthusiastic about these evolutions. There's still time for this to all shake out. We are in year 5 of what is normally an 8 to 12 year transition. It makes sense that we're seeing some outlines, but it hasn't gelled yet. But politics evolve. They follow changes in culture and economics and technology and geopolitics. We're dealing with the after effects of the Cold War and the rise of the digital age and a big wave of globalization and now deglobalization. Of course, we are going to manage our politics differently. Now, whether you love this or hate it, now is the time to act. If you're a business, national security, or fiscal conservative, and you want to remain a Republican, now is the time to act. You have a window of opportunity, because not everybody in that solid oval thinks it's a great idea to march to the Capitol with a Confederate flag and a can of Bear Mace and beat a cop. If you're trying to reclaim your party, now's the time. If you wait 2 years, it'll probably be too late, because we will be selecting candidates for the midterms a year from now. Okay, so that is where we are right now as a country internally.